Kora, a humble kennel keeper from the Highridge Pack, is left emotionally shattered after her mate Garrick publicly abandons her for the wealthy and beautiful Livia, humiliating her at a royal gathering where he expects to receive the Alpha King's blessing for his new union. While Kora struggles with the agony of her freshly severed mating bond, Alpha King Kalin of the Northern Wastes unexpectedly arrives, ignores every noble in attendance, walks directly to Kora, and shocks the entire kingdom by kneeling before her, recognizing her as his true fated mate. When Garrick insults Kora as a broken, worthless woman, Kalin nearly kills him, declaring that Garrick destroyed the bond with the king's own mate before claiming Kora under his protection. Despite Kora's fear, grief, and insistence that she is nothing more than a poor, discarded woman, Kalin refuses to leave her behind, wrapping her in his own cloak and taking her away to his fortress in the frozen northern wastes. During the brutal journey, Kalin's harsh but unwavering care keeps her alive as he protects her from the deadly cold feeds and hydrates her by force when necessary and refuses to let her succumb to exhaustion. Arriving at Ironhold, Kora faces a hardened pack of elite northern warriors who silently judge her frail appearance, but she earns their respect by refusing to remain on her knees despite her physical weakness, prompting Kalin to publicly declare her his queen and warn that anyone who disrespects or harms her will face brutal punishment. In his chambers, Kalin continues caring for her in his blunt, practical manner, warming her frostbitten feet, allowing her privacy, and treating her injuries without romance or manipulation. When Kora finally demands to know why such a feared king would kneel before someone like her, Kalin reveals that his immense alpha power constantly forces him to endure the overwhelming emotions of every wolf around him, leaving him in endless mental torment. But the moment he smelled Kora, she silenced that unbearable noise and became the only peace his wolf had ever known. He explains that he did not choose her for beauty status or politics, but because she alone anchors the monster within him. Though Kora remains deeply traumatized by Garrick's betrayal and terrified by the intensity of Kalin's devotion, she realizes that the emptiness left by her broken bond has been replaced by something far stronger, leaving her to face not the challenge of surviving abandonment, but the far more frightening challenge of learning whether she can trust and eventually love the ruthless king whose entire world has become centered on her. Sour ale and raw copper coated the back of Kora's throat. She swallowed the rising bile as Garrick paraded his new mate through the great hall. Livia Ryer of expensive crushed jasmine. Kora smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and sheer exhaustion. He hadn't just severed their mating bond, he had dragged its mangled corpse into the royal court for everyone to gawk at. She prayed to simply dissolve into the freezing flagstones. Instead, the heavy oak doors blew open and the Alpha King walked straight toward her. Torches sputtered in the iron sconces, spitting hot pitch onto the damp flagstones below. The great hall of Highridge was a cavernous, drafty beast of a room packed shoulder to shoulder with unwashed lords, heavily perfumed ladies, and the overwhelming stench of roasting fat. Kora stood shoved into the darkest corner she could find, her spine pressed against a pillar that wept cold condensation. The stone chilled her through the thin, outdated fabric of her slate gray gown. It was an old dress, it smelled faintly of camphor and the cedar chest it had been locked in for 3 years. She hadn't wanted to come tonight. She had begged her pack elder to let her stay behind to tend to the pups or scrub the kettles. Anything but this, but a broken bond was a political matter and her pack needed to show face. They needed to prove they weren't crippled by the insult. So she was here, sweating, freezing, and nauseous all at once. The phantom pain in her chest flared again. It wasn't a poetic, romantic ache. It felt like someone had taken a rusted spoon and hollowed out the space between her ribs. Every time she breathed, the empty cavity scraped against her lungs. When a wolf's mating bond was severed, the body treated it like an amputation. Itched, burned, throbbed with phantom pulses. A sudden shift in the room's chaotic noise made her look up. The fiddlers scraping away in the gallery faltered for a half-second before picking up a more frantic, upbeat tempo. Garrick had arrived. He walked through the archway, his chest puffed out beneath a tunic of deep plum velvet. He looked ridiculous. Kora stared at him, feeling a sudden violent twist of her stomach. For 5 years, she had washed his tunics, scrubbed his boots, and patched his hunting leathers. She knew the exact way his left shoulder slouched when he was tired and the way he ground his teeth in his sleep. Now he looked like a stranger playing dress-up in a dead man's clothes. Clinging to his arm was Livia. Livia was everything Kora wasn't. She was small, soft-edged, with hair the color of spun wheat and skin that hadn't seen a day of hard labor in the sun. She belonged to a wealthy lowland pack, a pack that traded in silver and silks rather than timber and blood. Livia wore a gown of pale blue silk that whispered against the dirty rushes on the floor. The worst part wasn't that Livia was beautiful. The worst part was that she smelled like jasmine oil. Expensive, cloying, heavy jasmine. It cut through the scent of sweat and roasted boar like a knife hitting Kora's sensitive nose from 50 paces away. Kora gripped her wooden goblet so tightly her knuckles turned white. Inside the cup was a sour, watery ale she had been nursing for an hour. She took a sip, grimacing as the acidic liquid hit her empty stomach. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The thought of swallowing meat made her gag. Garrick paused in the center of the room, turning to whisper something into Livia's ear. Livia threw her head back and laughed a bright, chiming sound that made Kora's murs grind together. Garrick smiled, a smug, satisfied curling of his lips. He pressed her hand to Livia's lower back exactly where he used to rest his hand on Kora's. Kora closed her eyes. Don't throw up, she told herself. Do not throw up on your only decent shoes. She could feel the eyes of the lesser pack members on her. They were watching from the edges of the room, whispering behind calloused hands. They pied her. The discarded mate. The female who wasn't strong enough, pretty enough, or politically advantageous enough to hold on to a rising lieutenant. She could smell their pity. It smelled like sour milk. She opened her eyes and stared hard at the grease congealing on a nearby trencher of abandoned meat. If she just stayed perfectly still, perfectly quiet, perhaps the night would swallow her whole. But Garrick, it seemed, wasn't content with just a public appearance. He wanted a performance, and he was steering his new perfect mate directly toward her corner. The music swelled, a shrill, chaotic squawking of lutes and fiddles that vibrated unpleasantly in Kora's skull. Garrick wove through the crowd with practiced ease, nodding to lords and clasping forearms with other warriors. He was making a point of being seen. He was a man who had traded up, and he wanted the entire Northern Territory to acknowledge his elevated status. Livia trailed beside him, a delicate hand resting lightly on his forearm. Kora pushed herself harder against the wet pillar, wishing the stone would just crack open and accept her. She considered bolting for the kitchens, but the path was blocked by a group of drunken elders arguing over a spilled cask of wine. She was trapped, Kora, Garrick said. His voice was exactly the same, the growly baritone that used to rumble against her ear in the dark. Hearing it now directed at her with the casual, polite distance one might use to address a stable hand made her skin crawl. She didn't immediately look up. She took her time swallowing the mouthful of sour ale, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be disrespectful. Finally, she leveled her gaze at him. Garrick, she said. Her voice was flat. Dead, he stopped a few feet away, close enough that the stench of Livia's jasmine oil made Korora's eyes water. Garrick looked her up and down, taking in her old gown, her unstyled hair, the dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something disgust crossed his face. Then the smug mask slammed back into place. I didn't expect to see you here, he said. It was a lie. He knew her pack elder would force her to attend. I live to exceed your expectations. Kora replied, her tone dripping with quiet venom. Livia peeked around Garrick's broad shoulder. Her eyes were wide, dull-like, and utterly empty of malice. That was the infuriating thing. Livia wasn't a cruel woman. She was just a porn who happened to be sitting on Kora's square. Is this her? Livia whispered loudly. Garrick puffed out his chest a fraction more. Yes, Kora, this is Livia, my mate. He forced the word out deliberately, striking it like a hammer against an anvil. The phantom wound in Kora's chest tore open a little wider, blood roared in her ears, a rushing sound like a swollen river. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just felt an overwhelming, crushing exhaustion. Congratulations, Kora said, her voice. You both look very shiny. Livia offered a hesitant, sympathetic smile. It was the worst thing she could have done. Garrick has told me so much about you. He said you were very capable with the hounds and such. Kora stared at the girl. Capable. She had fought rogues back to back with Garrick. She had stitched his flesh together when a feral bear nearly took his leg. She had starved during the winter famine so he could keep his strength up for the border patrols. Capable, I have my moments, Kora muttered, looking down at her cup. Garrick shifted his weight. The exchange wasn't giving him the triumphant thrill he had anticipated. Kora wasn't sobbing or begging, she just looked bored and vaguely sick. He needed a reaction. He needed to prove to himself that leaving her had destroyed her, because if it hadn't, what did that make him? The Alpha King is expected to arrive soon, Garrick said, puffing his chest again. I've been told he intends to personally bless the new alliances formed this season. Livia's father arranged for us to be presented first. Fascinating, Kora said. She shifted her grip on the horn cup. It was slick with condensation. I only bring it up, Garrick continued, his voice lowering to a patronizing murmur, because I know how emotional you can get. When the king blesses the bond, the scent of the pack magic will be strong. If you need to leave before that happens, I would understand. No one would judge you for slipping away. He was trying to dismiss her. He wanted her out of the room so she wouldn't be a dark, miserable stain on his perfect evening. Kora looked at him, really looked at him. He had a piece of roasted meat stuck between his front teeth. The velvet doublet was slightly too tight across his stomach. He wasn't a god, he wasn't a hero, he was just a selfish, ordinary man who had broken her in half for a prettier face and a richer doughy. I think, Kora said slowly, her voice carrying over the den of the hall, I will stay exactly where I am, Garrick, but thank you for your concern. It's touching. Before Garrick could formulate a response, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the great hall groaned in their iron hinges. The fiddlers abruptly stopped playing the final note, dying a horrible screeching death. The wind howled through the entrance, blowing out a dozen torches in a single breath and plunging the far end of the room into shadow. The temperature in the hall plummeted. The smell of roasted fat and cheap wine was instantly obliterated by a scent so sharp and wild it made Kora's teeth ache. It smelled like frostbite, like crushed pine needles and fresh wet blood on snow. The Alpha King had arrived. Silence slammed into the great hall like a physical weight. The chaotic babble of hundreds of drunk wolves ceased instantly. The only sounds left were the spitting of the remaining torches and the howling of the wind outside the keep. Kora shrank back against the damp stone, wishing she could meld into it. The Alpha King Kalin of the northern wastes was a ghost story whispered around campfires. He rarely left his fortress in the jagged peaks. He didn't care for politics balls or the petty squabbles of the land pacts. He cared about war borders and discipline. His presence here was an anomaly, a terrifying break in the natural order. Footsteps echoed on the flagstones, slow, deliberate, heavy boots striking stone. Out of the shadows emerged King Kalin. He didn't wear velvet or silk. He wore heavy boiled leather scarred and pitted from countless claws and blades. A thick cloak of black wolf fur was draped over his massive shoulders, fastened with a crude iron clasp. He was terrifyingly huge, towering over the tallest warriors in the room. His face was a map of violence. A thick, jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow and pulled the corner of his lip into a permanent slight sneer. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, pale cold and utterly devoid of mercy. The lords and ladies scrambled to bow and curtsy, dropping like wheat before a scythe as he passed. Garrick, still standing a few feet from Kora, hurriedly pushed Livia to the side and dropped into a deep, sweeping bow. He grabbed Livia's hand, pulling her down into a clumsy curtsy. This was his moment. The king was walking directly down their side of the hall. Garrick's ambition practically vibrated off him. He was ready to be seen, ready to be blessed, ready to step into the inner circle. Kora didn't bow, not out of defiance, but because her legs had locked. The sheer pressure of the king's aura was suffocating. The air grew thick, pressing against her eardrums, making her lungs burn. The scent of frost and blood was overwhelming, now erasing the sickening smell of Livia's jasmine entirely. Kalin walked down the aisle formed by the bowing courtiers. He didn't look left or right. He didn't acknowledge the murmurs of greeting. He approached Garrick. Garrick's head was bowed, but Kora could see the tight, expectant grin on his face. He shifted his stance slightly, preparing to stand and present his new mate. He opened his mouth, drawing a breath to speak the formal words of introduction. My King Garrick began. Kalin didn't break stride. He didn't pause. He didn't even look down. He simply walked straight past Garrick, his heavy leather cloak brushing against Garrick's plum velvet shoulder, leaving a smear of dark dampness behind. Garrick's mouth snapped shut. His face flushed a dark bruised red. The king kept walking straight toward the dark corner, straight toward the weeping stone pillar. Korora's heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. Move, she told herself. Step aside, Bo. Do something. But her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen. A rabbit trapped in the shadow of a hawk. Kalin stopped. He was less than 2 feet away. Up close, he smelled even more dangerous. Beneath the frost and the blood was the scent of ozone, the sharp metallic tang of lightning right before it strikes. He loomed over her, a mountain of dark leather and muscle. Kora gripped her wooden goblet, half expecting him to backhand her for not bowing. She tilted her chin up, refusing to close her eyes, refusing to flinch. The king stared down at her. His pale eyes rad over her face, taking in her exhaustion, her pale skin, the frayed neckline of her cheap gown. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deep breath, pulling in her scent. Then the unthinkable happened. King Kalin, the butcher of the north, The man who had torn the throats out of rival alphas with his bare teeth shifted his massive weight. His right boot scraped against the stone. The heavy leather creaked. He lowered himself, the movement fluid and terrifyingly controlled. Bone and leather met the cold flagstone with a heavy resonating thud. The king was kneeling. He knelt before her, dropping his head in the ultimate absolute submission of a wolf to its mate. A collective horrified gasp sucked all the remaining air out of the room. 100 goblets slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering against the floor. Kora stopped breathing. The wooden cup in her hand cracked under the pressure of her grip. Cheap ale spilling over her knuckles, dripping onto the floor just inches from the king's scarred knee. She stared down at the top of his dark head, her mind completely blank, the phantom ache in her chest suddenly vanishing, replaced by an inferno. Ale dripped from the splintered wood of Kora's cup. Drop by drop, it fell onto the porous stone, pooling dangerously close to the knee Kalin had pressed into the floor. She couldn't feel her fingers. The wooden shards bit into her palm, drawing a thin line of blood that mixed with the cheap brew, but her nervous system refused to register the pain. Her entire universe had narrowed down to the massive dark shape of the king and the overwhelming, terrifying smell of lightning and ice that poured off him. This was wrong, a cosmic, grotesque mistake. Kings did not kneel. They certainly did not kneel in the damp, drafty corners of provincial halls before discarded, exhausted females wearing 3-year-old camper-rented dresses. Kora swallowed hard, the sound violently loud in her own head. She wanted to feel the vindictive triumph the stories always promised. She wanted to look at Garrick to see his face pale and twisted in jealousy. She didn't. She didn't look at Garrick at all. She was too busy trying not to hyperventilate. Panic cold and sharp as a butcher's hook caught under her ribs. The phantom ache of her severed bond with Garrick had vanished. But what replaced it was not a gentle healing warmth. It was a terrifying gravity. She felt as though she was standing on the edge of a sheer cliff, the earth crumbling beneath her worn leather shoes, and the man kneeling before her was the abyss pulling her down. Breathe. The word was a low, guttural rasp, vibrating through the stone floor and straight up into the soles of her feet. Kalin hadn't moved. He hadn't raised his head. His gaze remained fixed on the hem of her outdated slate gray gown. Kora started, but her vocal cords seized. Her throat tasted like pennies and ash. You are not breathing. The king stated, his voice devoid of gentle reassurance. It was a command heavy and absolute. Slowly, he lifted his head. The movement was deliberate, telegraphing his intent so as not to spook her like one might approach a trapped rabid dog. His eyes met hers. Up close, the pale blue irises were fractured with shards of dark gray like ice cracking over a deep, turbulent river. There was no softness in them. There was no instant sweeping romance. There was only a primal, absolute recognition. He looked at her the way a starving wolf looks at an open throat. Kora's knees finally gave out. She didn't swoon gracefully, her legs simply unspooled like cheap yarn, and she hit the wet stone floor hard, her hip bone cracking painfully against the unyielding surface. The wooden goblet shattered completely, sending a spray of ale and splinters across Kalin's heavy leather boots. A collective gasp rippled through the frozen spectators. Someone near the center of the hall, a woman let out a whimpering sound of pure terror. To fall before a king was expected to collapse like a string-cut puppet and splash his boots with tavern swill was an executionable offense. Kalin did not flinch. He did not rise to his feet to summon his guards. Instead, he simply adjusted his posture, lowering himself from one knee to crouch entirely on the floor with her. The heavy black wolf fur of his cloak spilled over the dirty flagstones, gathering dust and grease. He didn't care. His massive calloused hand reached out. Kora flinched back so violently, her shoulder slammed into the weeping stone pillar behind her, the cold condensation soaked instantly through the thin fabric of her dress, shocking her system. Don't, she choked out, pressing herself into the rough masonry. Her voice was thin, ragged, entirely unheroic. Don't touch me. The king's hand stopped in midair. His fingers were thick, wrapped in leather bands, the knuckles scarred white. He held the limb perfectly still, a predator holding perfectly still to keep the prey from bolting. He withdrew his hand, slowly resting it on his own thigh. You are terrified, he noted. It wasn't a question. I am hallucinating. Kora shot back, her breathing shallow and frantic. I haven't eaten in 2 days. My bond was severed this morning, and I am currently bleeding into a puddle of ale. I'm clearly having a stress-induced psychotic break. Kalin's scarred upper lip twitched. It was a minuscule movement gone as quickly as it appeared, but it fundamentally altered the harsh geography of his face. You are bleeding. He repeated, his gaze dropping to her palm. Before she could hide her hand, the air in the room shifted. The heavy, paralyzing pressure of the king's aura spiked, rolling outward in a suffocating wave of dominance. The temperature in the hall plummeted another 10 degrees. Torches that had been burning steadily flickered and died, casting long, grotesque shadows across the gathered pack members. "My king!" The voice cracked through the silence like a dropped plate. It was Garrick. Kora squeezed her eyes shut. Idiot. Absolute suicidal idiot. Garrick had stepped out of the line of bowing courtiers, Livia's delicate hand falling from his arm. His face was a patchwork of red and white confusion, wearing violently with his innate arrogant need to assert himself. He couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. In his mind, Kora was the discarded scraps. She was the anchor weighing him down. She was not the mate of the apex predator of the northern wastes. "My king," Garrick repeated, his voice slightly steadier, stepping closer. "There has been a mistake. That female is Kora. She is..." He hesitated, the word sticking in his throat under the sudden crushing weight of Kalin's silent attention. "She is a broken vessel. Our bond was severed. She is unwell." Kalin slowly turned his head. He didn't stand. He remained crouched on the wet floor, but the sheer menace rolling off his frame made him seem 10 feet tall. "A broken vessel," Kalin repeated. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, harsh and metallic. "Yes, sire." Garrick nodded eagerly, sensing an opening to save the situation, to drag the spotlight back where it belonged. "She is unstable. I had to end our union for the good of the pack. She lacks the fortitude for the inner circles. If you require a female from Highridge, there are many untouched." Kalin moved. It was not a human movement. It was a blur of black leather and raw kinetic violence. 1 second the king was crouched on the floor. The next he had crossed the 5 feet separating him from Garrick. He didn't draw a blade. He simply gripped Garrick by the throat with one massive hand and lifted him entirely off the floor. Livia screamed a high, piercing sound that finally shattered the silence, scrambling backward until she tripped over a serving platter and tumbled into the rushes. Garrick gagged his hands, flying up to claw futilely at the iron grip crushing his windpipe. His legs kicked empty air, his fine plum velvet tunic bunched up around his ears. "You severed a bond with my mate," Kalin said, his voice dropping an octave, shaking the dust from the rafters. The smell of ozone in the room became so thick it tasted like copper on the tongue. "You hollowed out her chest. You left her bleeding in a corner, and now you speak to me of her fortitude." My king, Garrick wheezed, his eyes bulging, his face turning a mottled, ugly purple. "If you ever," Kalin whispered, the quietness of his tone far more terrifying than a roar. "Speak of her again. If you ever look at her again, I will tear your lungs through your ribs and feed them to the crows. Not if you understand." Garrick managed a frantic, jerking dip of his chin. Kalin dropped him. He didn't toss him aside or throw him to the floor. He simply opened his hand, letting Garrick crash onto the unyielding stone like a sack of wet grain. Garrick hit the ground, coughing and retching, curling into a tight, pathetic ball, clutching his bruised throat. The king didn't spare him a second glance. He turned his back on the gasping lieutenant and walked back to Kora. She hadn't moved. She was still pressed against the damp pillar, her chest heaving, staring at the casual brutality she had just witnessed. Garrick was one of the strongest warriors in Highridge. He had taken down rogue wolves twice his size. Kalin had swatted him like a bothersome fly without even elevating his heart rate. "Stand up," Kalin said, looking down at her. The violent rage was gone from his voice, replaced by that same immovable, factual tone. Kora shook her head. "I can't. My legs." Kalin didn't argue. He reached down, ignoring her previous protest, and slid his hands under her arms. His grip was entirely impersonal. Yet the moment his leather-clad hands clamped over her ribs, a jolt of heat shot straight through her bones. It bypassed the cold damp of her dress, bypassed her exhausted muscles, and slammed directly into the hollow, aching cavity in her chest. She gasped a sharp intake of air as he lifted her effortlessly to her feet. "You are coming with me," he stated, releasing her the moment she was steady on her feet. "I can't..." Kora stammered, panic surging fresh and sharp. "My pack, Elder Thomas, I have duties. I patched the hunting leathers. I can't just leave." It was an absurd argument. She was arguing laundry logistics with the sovereign ruler of the North. Kalin stared at her unblinking. "You have no pack. The bond is severed. You are mine now." He reached out and unfastened the heavy iron clasp at his throat. The black wolf fur cloak slipped from his shoulders. With a single fluid motion, he draped it around Kora. The sheer weight of the garment nearly buckled her knees again. It was heavy, smelling fiercely of pine horse sweat and the underlying intoxicating scent of the king himself. It swallowed her whole, dropping all the way to the floor, instantly warming her freezing skin. "Walk," Kalin commanded. He didn't offer his arm. He didn't wait for her to gather her non-existent belongings. He simply turned and began walking back down the long aisle toward the massive oak doors, expecting her to follow. Kora stood trembling in the oversized cloak. She looked at the crowd. Elder Thomas, her pack leader, stood near the head table, his face perfectly pale, his mouth clamped shut. He offered no objection. He made no move to stop her. No one did. She looked down at Garrick, who was still on his knees, wheezing, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, stripped of every ounce of his pride. Livia was weeping quietly into her hands. Kora pulled the heavy fur tighter around her shoulders. The heat of it felt like a brand. She was trading one cage for an entirely different, infinitely more dangerous one. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she stepped over the shattered remains of her wooden goblet and followed the king out of the hall. Stepping out of the Highridge keep was like walking into a frozen knife. The wind tore across the open courtyard, carrying fine, biting particles of snow that stung the cheeks and watered the eyes. Kora buried her face deeper into the thick collar of Kalin's cloak. The fur tickled her nose, smelling intensely of crushed pine and raw masculinity. It was overwhelming, completely drowning out the lingering stench of the great hall's roasting fat and sour wine. Kalin moved with long ground-eating strides, his heavy boots crunching loudly in the packed snow. Without his cloak, he wore only the scarred leather tunic over his broad chest. The freezing temperature didn't seem to bother him. He walked as though the storm was a minor inconvenience entirely beneath his notice. Kora struggled to keep up. Her leather shoes were paper-thin, entirely unsuited for the deep snowdrifts accumulating in the courtyard. Her feet went numb within seconds. Every step was a clumsy, heavy effort weighed down by exhaustion shock and the massive garment dragging behind her like a royal train. "My king," Elder Thomas's voice called out from the doorway of the keep, desperate and thin over the howling wind. Kalin stopped. He didn't turn around. He merely tilted his head slightly, listening. Elder Thomas scrambled down the stone steps, slipping slightly on the ice. He kept a respectful distance of 20 paces, bowing low. "My king, the roads are treacherous. The storm is worsening. We have prepared the royal chambers for you. Please honor us with your presence for the night." Kora stopped a few feet behind Kalin, pulling the cloak tighter. The thought of a warm bed, even a strange one, made her joints ache with longing. She was so tired she felt nauseous. Her vision swam at the edges, blurring the falling snow into long, streaky lines. "Highridge holds no honor for me," Kalin replied. His voice carried effortlessly over the gale. "Your lieutenant publicly discarded my mate. Your pack allowed her to stand bleeding in a corner. If I stay within these walls tonight, I will systematically slaughter every male of fighting age before dawn." Elder Thomas choked. He physically recoiled, taking a step back up the icy stairs, his hands raised in placation. "My king, we did not know the bond was. It was have your strongest horses brought to the gates." Kalin interrupted his tone, bored, dismissing the elder entirely. "And supplies." "We ride for the jagged peaks immediately." He resumed walking. Kora stared at his broad back, a fresh wave of panic cresting in her chest, the jagged peaks, the northern wastes. It was a brutal, unforgiving territory of ice and stone. Packs up there were savage living, entirely off the hunt, constantly wearing with rogues and the elements. She had never been further north than the Highridge borders. She was a seamstress, a kennel tender. She wasn't built for the ice. "Wait!" Kora gasped, rushing forward to catch up to him. She stumbled, her frozen foot catching on a hidden cobblestone beneath the snow. She pitched forward, bracing for the hard impact of the icy ground. It never came. Kalin spun around with terrifying speed, catching her by the forearms before her knees even brushed the snow. His grip was firm, holding her upright with zero effort. The physical contact sent another violent jolt of heat through her system, racing up her arms and exploding in her chest. It felt like swallowing hot coals. "You cannot walk in those shoes," he observed, looking down at her frozen, shivering feet. "I can't ride to the jagged peaks," Kora argued back, her teeth chattering so violently she bit her tongue. The metallic taste of fresh blood flooded her mouth, adding to her nausea. "I will die before we reach the first pass. I don't have furs. I don't have supplies. I don't." She swallowed hard, the tears she had refused to shed inside the hall finally threatening to spill. "I don't even know you." Kalin stared down at her. The wind whipped his dark hair around his face, catching in the jagged scar across his eyebrow. He didn't look sympathetic. He looked like a stone monument analyzing a structural flaw in a building. "You will not die," he stated. "I will not permit it." Before she could process the sheer arrogance of the statement, Kalin released her arms only to immediately hook one arm behind her back and the other under her knees. He lifted her off the ground as easily as if she were a bundle of dry kindling. Kora gasped instinctively, throwing her arms around his thick neck to steady herself. The leather of his tunic was cold against her cheek, but the body beneath it radiated a staggering furnace-like heat. "Put me down," she demanded, though her voice lacked any real authority. It was a weak, breathless whisper. "You are too slow," Kalin replied calmly, walking towards the heavy iron gates of the courtyard where the stable masters were already rushing to bring out 4 massive, heavily muscled war horses. The beasts snorted out plumes of white steam, their hooves striking the frozen earth with impatient thuds. Kora stopped fighting. She let her head rest against his solid chest, her eyes closing involuntarily. The scent of ozone and pine wrapped around her, blocking out the cold, blocking out the terror of the unknown. Her body, betraying her mind, completely recognized the absolute safety in his hold. The hollow, agonizing crater left by Garrick's betrayal stopped aching. The phantom itch receded, replaced by a strange, heavy anchor. She hated it. She hated that her wolf recognized this stranger as home. She hated that her body submitted to the bond so easily, craving the heat and the ironclad protection he offered. It felt like weakness. It felt like losing herself all over again just hours after being discarded. "I don't want this," she whispered into the freezing air, not entirely sure if she was talking to him or to herself. Kalin paused beside a massive black stallion. The beast tossed its heavy head, eyeing Kora with dark, intelligent eyes. The king adjusted his grip on her, pulling her a fraction closer to his chest. He didn't look down at her, keeping his gaze fixed on the northern horizon where the dark, jagged teeth of the mountains tore into the snowy sky. "It does not matter what you want," Kalin said softly, his voice a low rumble beneath her ear. "The bond is forged. You are my mate. You will survive the journey. You will rule by my side, and eventually you will learn to stop fighting your own nature." He hoisted her up, depositing her sideways into the saddle of the black stallion. The leather of the saddle was freezing, a sharp contrast to the heat of his arms. Kalin swung himself up behind her with effortless grace, his massive frame boxing her in, sheltering her back from the biting wind. He reached around her to grab the heavy leather res. His arms were solid iron bars on either side of her ribs. "Hold on," he commanded. Kora gripped the coarse mane of the stallion just as Kalin dug his heels into the beast's flanks. The horse surged forward, tearing out of the Highridge gates and into the blinding, freezing white of the northern storm. Behind them, the heavy iron gates slammed shut, sealing away her past, her pack, and the only life she had ever known. Ahead lay nothing but ice stone and the terrifying gravity of the monster holding her tight against his chest. Snow bit into her exposed skin like tiny furious wasps. Hours bled into one continuous freezing nightmare. Kalin did not slow the massive black stallion driving the beast through snowdrifts that reached its chest. Kora had long since lost feeling in her toes. Her hands buried deep within the thick black wolf fur of the king's cloak were cramped and aching from gripping the coarse mane. Every jolting step of the horse sent a fresh spike of pain up her spine. The cheap leather of her shoes provided zero insulation, and her damp slate-gray gown was plastered to her legs, frozen stiff in places. He was a wall of solid heat behind her. That was the only reason she wasn't dead. His thighs bracketed hers, iron-hard and immovable, pinning her to the saddle. His chest rested against her back, his heartbeat a slow, steady thud that vibrated through her ribs. It was infuriating. Her own body betrayed her at every turn, instinctively leaning into his warmth, craving the heavy, dominant scent of ozone and pine. The new bond, freshly forged and terrifyingly deep, hummed in her veins like a live wire. It demanded she submit, relax, and trust the apex predator at her back. Kora fought it with every ounce of her remaining willpower. She kept her spine rigid, refusing to completely slump against him even as her muscles screamed in protest. "You are burning energy you do not have." Kalin's voice broke the relentless howling of the wind. It was not a gentle observation, it sounded like gravel grinding against iron. "I am perfectly fine," Kora lied, her teeth chattering so violently she accidentally bit her cheek. A fresh copper taste flooded her mouth. Kalin shifted behind her one massive hand, dropping the res to grip her waist. His fingers dug past the thick fur, pressing directly into her ribs. "You are shivering so violently the horse feels it. Stop fighting me. I am not fighting you." She snapped through her voice lacked any real venom. It was thin and ready. "I am simply trying not to freeze to your armor." He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled her flush against his chest, completely eliminating the tiny gap she had stubbornly maintained. The sheer force of his heat enveloped her, instantly melting the frost that had gathered on her collar. It felt like stepping into a forge. A soft, involuntary sigh escaped her lips before she could clamp them shut. Humiliation burned her cheeks hotter than the wind. She hated this. She hated that she needed him. Just hours ago, she had been a discarded vessel mourning a 5-year bond that Garrick had severed with all the emotional weight of taking out the trash. Now she was clinging to the Northern King completely at his mercy, tethered by a biological imperative she didn't ask for. The sky began to bleed into a bruised purplish-black twilight. The terrain shifted beneath them. The rolling hills of the lands gave way to steep, treacherous inclines. The snow thinned, replaced by jagged black rocks that tore at the howling wind. This was the border of the Wastes. Kalin finally pulled back on the reins. The stallion slowed to a heavy, steam-breathing walk, picking its way carefully through a narrow mountain pass. The wind here was slightly blocked by the towering granite walls, but the temperature plummeted even further. The air was thin, smelling sharply of sulfur and ancient undisturbed ice. Drink. Kalin suddenly stopped the horse completely in the shadow of an overhang. He unhooked a thick leather water skin from the saddle horn and thrust it over her shoulder. Kora stared at it. Her hands were too frozen to let go of the cloak. I can't. A heavy sigh vibrated against her back. Kalin reached around, uncocking the skin with his teeth, spitting the wooden stopper into his palm. He tipped her head back with a rough, calloused hand against her jaw, pressing the leather spout to her chapped lips. The water was violently cold. It hit her empty stomach like a stone. She gagged violently, twisting her head away slowly. Kalin commanded, gripping her jaw firmly, completely ignoring her resistance. You are dehydrated. Drink or I will force it down your throat. It wasn't a threat, it was a simple logistical fact. Kora closed her eyes, swallowing the freezing liquid in tiny, painful sips. Water ran down her chin, soaking into the collar of her worn dress, but she managed to keep it down. Enough. Kalin pulled the skin away, recocking it. He didn't offer her food. He knew her stomach wouldn't hold it. Instead, he dug his heels back into the stallion. We are 2 hours from the stronghold. Try not to die before we arrive. It would be a waste of a difficult ride. Kora let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. There was no poetry in him, no grand declarations of eternal love, just brutal, pragmatic survival. She let her head fall back against his shoulder, finally too exhausted to maintain the rigid posture. The rhythmic crunch of hooves on stone lulled her into a dark, dreamless half-sleep. The smell of lightning and blood her only anchor in the void. Stone ground against stone, a massive, agonizing screech that ripped Kora from her fractured exhaustion. She jerked upright in the saddle, her muscles screaming in protest, stiff and locked from the freezing cold. They had stopped. Before them loomed a fortress that looked less built and more violently carved from the living rock of the mountain. There were no graceful spires, no delicate glass windows, no banners flapping in the wind. It was a massive, brutalist structure of dark gray granite squatting aggressively against the side of a jagged peak. Iron braziers flared along the battlements, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow. The gate's 2 slabs of solid, rusted iron were currently grinding open, pulled by unseen, groaning chains. This was Ironhold, the seat of the Alpha King. It looked like a tomb. The scent hit her instantly. Highridge had smelled of roasted pork, cheap perfume, and damp earth. Ironhold smelled of raw, untamed carnivore. Wet fur, wood smoke, fresh blood, and an underlying sharp tang of ozone that mirrored Kalin's own scent but lacked his absolute purity. It was the smell of 100 lethal predators crammed into a stone cage. Do not show fear, Kalin murmured in her ear, his breath hot against her freezing skin. They will smell it, and they will test you. I am not afraid. Kora lied, her voice cracking slightly. Her heart was hammering, a frantic bird-like rhythm against her ribs. You're terrified. Your pulse is erratic, and you smell like sour panic. Kalin's candor was as brutal as the landscape. Suppress it. You are the king's mate. Act like it. He spurred the stallion forward. They rode through the dark archway of the gates, stepping into a massive open-air courtyard. The wind was cut off, but the cold remained trapped within the stone walls. The courtyard was not empty. Dozens of wolves, some in their human forms, some entirely shifted, stood waiting. There was no cheering, no bowing, no formal lines of courtiers. These were warriors. They wore heavy furs and scarred leathers. Their faces were weathered, their eyes hard and feral. Many bore fresh, gaping wounds that were barely stitched, bleeding freely onto the packed snow. They watched the black stallion enter in absolute eerie silence. Kora tightened her grip on the wolf fur cloak. The eyes boring into her were not pitying like the lesser pack members at Highridge had been. They were analytical. They were judging her weight, her stamina, her scent. They were looking at her slate gray, out-of-fashion dress and her shivering frame, and they were finding her severely wanting. Kalin brought the stallion to a halt in the center of the yard. He threw his leg over the saddle horn, dropping to the frozen earth with a heavy thud that cracked the ice beneath his boots. The sheer force of his presence seemed to push the gathered pack members back half a step. He didn't say a word to them. He simply turned back to Kora, raising his scarred hands toward her. She hesitated. Every muscle in her body was locked. The thought of moving her legs made her want to weep. "Come," he ordered quietly. Kora took a shallow breath, gripping his forearms. He pulled her from the saddle as if she weighed nothing. The moment her paper-thin shoes hit the icy ground, her deadened legs buckled. Her knees hit the snow hard, tearing the fabric of her dress. A low, collective murmur rippled through the courtyard. A sound of disdain. A king's mate did not fall. Humiliation, hot and utterly corrosive, flooded Kora's veins. It burned away the freezing cold. It burned away the exhaustion. It burned away the lingering ghosts of Garrick and Livia. She was absolutely damned if she was going to kneel in the dirt for these feral strangers. Kalin reached down to haul her up, but she shoved his hands away. It was a stupid, suicidal gesture. You did not reject the Alpha King in front of his pack. The courtyard went dead silent. The tension snapped taut, heavy enough to choke on. Kalin's pale, frozen eyes narrowed, dropping to where she knelt in the snow. He didn't move. He let his hands fall to his sides, watching her. Kora dug her bleeding, frozen fingers into the rough ice. Her joints popped. Her muscles screamed, vibrating with fatigue. She ground her teeth together so hard her jaw ached, and slowly, painfully, she pushed herself upright. She swayed violently, her vision graying at the edges, but she locked her knees and stood. She didn't look at Kalin. She looked directly at the crowd. A woman stepped forward from the front line of warriors. She was exceptionally tall, her blonde hair woven into intricate battle-ready braids. A fresh, jagged claw mark ran from her temple down to her jawline, weeping slow drops of crimson. She wore no cloak, only heavy leather armor that left her tattooed arms bare to the biting cold. The woman stalked toward Kora. Her movements were fluid, predatory. She didn't look at Kalin for permission. She simply walked right up to Kora, stopping inches away. Kora stood her ground, though her instincts screamed at her to bare her throat in submission. The woman was easily twice her strength. The blonde warrior leaned in her nose, brushing the collar of Kalin's thick cloak that draped over Kora's shivering shoulders. She inhaled deeply, loudly, taking in Kora's scent. She smelled the damp wool of the old dress, the stale sweat of terror, the faint lingering echo of a severed bond, and the overwhelming fresh brand of Kalin's claim. For a long, agonizing moment, the warrior stared into Kora's eyes. Kora held the gaze. She didn't blink. She focused entirely on not collapsing, pouring every ounce of her anger and bitterness into keeping her spine straight. The warrior stepped back. She wiped a drop of blood from her jawline with a calloused thumb, her expression unreadable. "She smells like old grief and cheap ale," the warrior announced to the courtyard, her voice raspy and loud. Then she looked directly at Kalin. "But she stands when her bones are freezing. She will not break." Kalin did not smile. He did not look relieved. He simply nodded once. "Her name is Kora," Kalin stated, his voice carrying effortlessly off the granite walls, heavy with absolute, unquestionable authority. "She is the anchor to my blood. She is the queen of the Wastes. Anyone who looks at her with disrespect will lose their eyes. Anyone who touches her with malice will lose their hands." He turned back to Kora, his expression flattening back into that unreadable stone mask. He didn't offer his arm or try to carry her again. He knew she had just drawn a line in the snow, proving her own terrible stubbornness. "Walk," he commanded, gesturing toward the heavy iron doors of the inner keep. Kora pulled the massive cloak tighter around herself, her fingers leaving faint smears of blood on the dark fur. Her hip ached from the fall in Highridge, her feet were numb blocks of ice, and her stomach rolled with nauseating emptiness. But as she walked past the scarred warrior woman, past the feral watching eyes of the northern pack, she kept her chin perfectly level. She was walking into a brutal frozen hell chained to a monster. But she was entirely done kneeling. Iron hinges groaned a sound like a dying beast as the massive doors sealed behind them. The immediate absence of the howling wind left a ringing silence in Kora's ears, quickly filled by the crackle of massive hearth fires and the heavy rhythmic striking of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere deep in the bowels of the keep. Ironhold's interior was as unforgiving as its exterior. No tapestries, no rushes to soften the flagstones, just bare soot-stained rock and the overpowering scent of rendered animal fat and hot steel. Kora's vision swam. The sudden shift in temperature from deadly frost to suffocating heat was the final blow to her battered nervous system. Her knees, locked so stubbornly in the courtyard, finally gave way entirely. She didn't hit the floor. Kalin caught her. He didn't scoop her up dramatically. He simply clamped a massive hand around her upper arm, hauling her upright with a sharp, involuntary grunt. "You are done performing," he muttered, his voice a low vibration that bypassed her ears and rattled directly against her rib cage. He released her arm, and in one fluid motion bent down to shove his shoulder into her midsection, lifting her in a brutal, efficient fireman's carry. "Put me down," Kora rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. The blood rushed to her head, making her deeply nauseous. "No," Kalin replied. He climbed the winding stone staircase, his heavy boots echoing off the curved walls. He wasn't breathing hard. She was a sack of grain to him, a logistical problem to be transported from the courtyard to his quarters. They reached a heavy wooden door. Kalin kicked it open. The Alpha King's chambers were a cavernous, sparsely furnished room dominated by a roaring fireplace large enough to roast an ox. The heat hit Kora like a physical blow. Kalin walked to the center of the room and deposited her onto a massive bed framed in dark, unpolished iron and piled high with thick, coarse pelts. Kora scrambled backward the moment her back hit the furs. Panic, hot and sharp, pursed through the fog of exhaustion. She pulled her knees to her chest, curling into a tight defensive ball. Her wet slate-gray dress clung to her skin, stiff with melted snow and grime. Kalin didn't leap upon her. He didn't even look at her. He walked to the hearth, unfastened the heavy leather straps of his armor, and let the chest piece drop to the stone floor with a deafening clatter. Underneath, he wore a simple sweat-stained linen tunic that clung to the thick, scarred musculature of his back. He grabbed an iron poker and violently stabbed at the burning logs, sending a shower of orange sparks up the soot-blackened chimney. "Take off the dress." Kora froze. Her heart slammed against her sternum. "Excuse me." Kalin turned. The firelight cast deep demonic shadows across the jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow. "Your clothes are wet. You have minor frostbite on your extremities. If you sit in that damp fabric, you will develop a fever, and I do not have the time to nurse a corpse. Take it off." It wasn't a seduction. It was an order delivered with the same flat, factual tone he used to command his warriors. He tossed a heavy, dry woolen blanket onto the edge of the furs. "Wrap yourself in that. Leave the dress on the floor. I will have someone burn it." "It is my only dress," Kora whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of cold and profound paralyzing vulnerability. "It smells like a camper chest and another man's rejection," Kalin stated brutally. "It burns." He turned his back to her, returning his attention to the fire. He was giving her privacy. It was a jarring, entirely unexpected courtesy from a man who had just threatened to tear out a lieutenant's lungs. Kora's hands shook so badly she could barely manipulate the cheap tin buttons at her collar. Her fingers were clumsy numbs of meat. She fought the wet fabric, her breath hitching in small, pathetic gasps, terrified he would turn around, terrified he would lose his meager patience. She finally managed to peel the sodden garment away, leaving her in thin, worn undergarments. She snatched the heavy wool blanket, wrapping it so tightly around her shoulders, she felt her own collarbones grind together. "Done," she croaked. Kalin turned. He walked back to the bed, ignoring the discarded dress. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the iron frame groaned under his massive weight. He reached out and grabbed her ankle. Kora flinched, trying to kick free, but his grip was an iron shackle. He pulled her foot toward him, resting it on his thick thigh. He didn't bother untying the leather laces of her ruined shoes. He drew a hunting knife from his belt, a wicked serrated blade of dark steel, and sliced through the cheap leather with a single brutal motion, peeling the frozen ruin away from her skin. Her foot was a mottled, horrifying shade of blue and stark white. "Do not pull away," Kalin warned quietly. He dropped the knife and wrapped both his massive, calloused hands around her frozen foot. The heat of his skin was staggering. It felt like being plunged into boiling water, Kora screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and agonizing. As the deadened nerves violently reawakened, the pain was excruciating. It felt like 1,000 rusted needles driving into her bones. She thrashed, kicking wildly with her other leg, but Kalin simply absorbed the blows. He shifted his weight, pinning her free leg beneath his heavy forearm while maintaining his vice-like grip on her freezing foot. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Let it burn. The pain means the tissue is alive." Tears hot and thick spilled over Kora's cheeks. She hated crying. She had not cried when Garrick severed the bond. She had not cried when he paraded Livia in the Great Hall, but the sheer agonizing intimacy of this violent thawing broke something loose inside her. She sobbed, her fingers twisting into the coarse pelts beneath her. Kalin didn't offer soothing platitudes. He didn't stroke her hair. He just held her foot against the furnace of his body, waiting out her agony with the stoic, unmovable patience of a mountain. Slowly, the excruciating burning faded into a deep, heavy ache. The unnatural white of her toes gave way to an angry, flushed red. Only then did he release her foot. He repeated the exact same brutal process with the other, his face a mask of total concentration, completely immune to her sobbing. When both feet were stripped and radiating heat, he stood up, wiped his hands on his linen tunic, and walked away. Kora lay curled on her side, trembling violently beneath the scratchy wool, her chest heaving. The room smelled of burning cedar, old leather, and the overpowering metallic tang of the king's scent. It was terrifying. It was completely alien. Yet as the phantom itch in her chest, the hollow space Garrick had left, remained perfectly deeply silent, Kora realized a horrifying truth. She wasn't mourning her old life anymore. She was just terrified of surviving the new one. Sleep hit her like a heavy stone dropped into a dark well. There were no dreams, no fading echoes of Livia's chiming laugh or the smell of jasmine. There was only the heavy, suffocating warmth of the furs and the rhythmic crackle of the hearth. When Kora finally opened her eyes, the lighting in the chamber hadn't changed, but the deep bone-deep ache of exhaustion had shifted from a screaming alarm to a dull, manageable throb. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Her mouth tasted like old copper. She shifted beneath the heavy pelts, her feet throbbed, wrapped in fresh, dry linen bandages. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, the thick wool blanket slipping down to pull around her waist. Kalin was sitting in a heavy wooden chair near the fire. He was not looking at her. He held a piece of scarred leather armor across his knees, methodically driving an iron all through the thick hide, stitching a deep claw mark with heavy wax thread. He had stripped off the sweat-stained tunic. His torso was a map of extreme violence. Deep white scars crisscrossed his chest and ribs, some jagged and old, some pink and angry. A massive black tattoo of a snarling wolf's head covered his left pectoral, its jaws entirely wrapping around his collarbone. He smelled different now. The sharp, aggressive edge of ozone had faded, replaced by a deep, dark earthiness, pine sap, wood smoke, and something darker like the smell of a storm right before the rain breaks. "You slept for 18 hours, Kalin said. He didn't look up from his work. He pulled the thick thread tight, his heavy bicep bunching with the effort. Kora swallowed hard. "I'm thirsty." Kalin set the armor down on the stone floor. He stood his massive frame blocking out the firelight and picked up a heavy iron flag from a small wooden table. He walked to the edge of the bed and held it out. Kora reached for it, her fingers brushed against his knuckles. The contact sent a sharp, involuntary shock of heat up her arm, settling deep in her chest. She snatched the flag, pulling it to her chest as if to protect herself from the current. The water was violently cold and tasted faintly of iron, but she drank it greedily, water spilling down her chin to drip onto her collarbone. Kalin watched her. His pale, fractured eyes tracked the droplet of water until it disappeared beneath the edge of the wool blanket. He didn't move away when she lowered the flag. He stayed standing over her, an intimidating, immovable mass. "Why?" Kora asked. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual cynical armor. "Why did you kneel?" Kalin's jaw tightened. The jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow distorted slightly. He took the empty flag from her trembling hands and set it on the floor with a dull clank. "You think it was a political maneuver to shame the Highridge Lieutenant Garrick isn't important enough for the King of the Wastes to play political games with?" Kora replied flatly. "I am a 26-year-old kennel tender. I have bad teeth, no doughy, and zero political leverage. There are 100 females in your own pack stronger and faster than me. I want to know why you embarrassed yourself in front of a room full of lowlanders." Kalin let out a low, rough exhalation. It sounded almost like a laugh, but his face remained entirely grim. He braced his massive, heavily scarred hands on the iron footboard of the bed, leaning his weight forward. The chains of his dark aura, the heavy, dominant pressure that usually saturated the air around him, suddenly retracted. For the first time since he crashed into the Great Hall, he felt entirely terrifyingly vulnerable. "You do not understand the nature of an alpha's blood," Kalin said quietly. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a stark, terrifying honesty. "It is not a blessing, it is a constant screaming noise. Every heartbeat of every wolf in that courtyard, I feel it. Every drop of fear, every spike of anger, every minor dispute, it rings in my skull. It is a pressure that crushes the spine." He looked at her, his pale eyes burning into hers. "When I walked into that hall in Highridge, the noise was deafening. The stench of their petty, pathetic ambitions made me want to slaughter them all just to buy a moment of silence." He lifted his right hand from the iron rail. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement just as he had on the damp stone floor. He didn't touch her skin. He let his rough, scarred knuckles graze the edge of the wool blanket covering her shoulder. "And then I smelled you," Kalin whispered. Kora stopped breathing. The heat radiating from his hand seeped through the thick wool, sinking directly into her aching chest. "You smelled like copper, like old grief and absolute exhaustion." Kalin continued, his voice dropping to a harsh rasp. "But beneath it, you smelled like an anchor. The moment my eyes locked on you, the screaming in my head stopped. The pressure vanished, the world went entirely beautifully silent. My beast did not see a kennel tender with a ruined dress. My beast saw the only quiet harbor in a world made entirely of violence. So I knelt." Kora stared at him. The cynical, bitter walls she had built around her heart over the last 5 years trembled. This wasn't a fairy tale. He wasn't a knight offering salvation. He was a drowning monster, and she was his oxygen. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his dependency terrified her more than his rage ever could. "I am broken," Kora said, her voice shaking violently. "My bond was severed. I am hollow." Kalin dropped his hand. He stepped back, the mask of the brutal king slamming firmly back into place. The momentary vulnerability vanished, swallowed entirely by the unyielding predator. "You are not hollow. You are excavated." Kalin stated, his tone flat, factual, and completely absolute, "and I intend to fill the space." He turned and walked back to the heavy wooden chair, picking up his scarred armor and the iron awl. He did not ask for her permission. He did not wait for her acceptance. He simply sat down in the firelight and resumed pulling the heavy thread through the dead leather, tethering her reality to his own with every pull. Kora pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the wind howled violently, tearing at the stone walls of the fortress. Inside, the fire snapped and spat. The phantom itch in her chest was completely gone, replaced by a solid, terrifying, burning weight. She was trapped in the iron cage of the northbound to a butcher who needed her more than he needed his own lungs. She closed her eyes, listening to the heavy sound of the awl punching through leather, finally realizing the terrible truth of her existence. She had survived the betrayal. Now she just had to survive the devotion. Blood and ice make a heavy crown, and Kora's survival in Ironhold has only just begun. Will she let the king's brutal devotion forge her into a queen,